This is Dylan Thomas's Over Sir John's Hill. Over Sir John's Hill, a hawk on fire hangs still. In a hoisted cloud, at drop of dusk, he pulls to his claws and gallows up the rays of his eyes the small birds of the bay. And the shrill child's play, wars, of the sparrows and such who swan sing, dusk in wrangling hedges. And blithely they squawk to fiery Tyburn over the wrestle of elms until the flash the noosed hawk crashes, and slowly the fishing holy stalking heron in the river Towie below bows his tilted headstone. Flash and plumes crack, and a black cap of jackdaws Sir John's just hill dawns, and again the gulled bird's hair to the hawk on fire the halter height over Towie's fins. In a whack of wind, there where elegiac fisher-bird stabs and paddles, in the pebbly, dab-filled shallow and sedge, and dilly-dilly calls the loft-hawk, come and be killed. I open the leaves of the water at a passage of psalms and shadows among the pincered sand crabs prancing, and read in a shell, death clear as buoy's bell, all praise of the hawk on fire in a hawk-eyed dusk be sung. When his viperish fuse hangs looped with flames under the brand wing, and blessed shall young green chickens of the bay and bushes cluck, dilly dilly, come, let us die. We grieve as the blithe birds never again leave shingle and elm, the heron and I, young Aesop, fabling to the near night by the dingle of eels, Saint Heron hymning in the shell-hung distant, crystal harbour vale, where the sea cobbles sail, and wharves of water where the walls dance and the white cranes stilt. It is the heron and I, under judging Sir John's elmed hill, tell-tale the knelled guilt of the led-astray birds, whom God for their breast of whistles have mercy on, God in his whirlwind silence save, who marks the sparrows' hail for their souls' song. Now the heron grieves in the weeded verge. Through windows of dusk I see the tilting whispering heron mirrored go, as the snapped feathers snow. Fishing in the tear of the Towie, only a hoot owl hollows, a grass blade blown in cupped hands in the looted elms, and no green cocks or hens shout. Now, on Sir John's Hill, the heron, ankling the scaly lowlands of the waves, makes all the music, and I who hear the tune of the slow were-willow river grave, before the lunge of the night, the notes on this time-shaken stone, for the sake of the souls of the slain birds sailing. Some information on Dylan Thomas himself, the author of Sir John's Hill. He wrote it in 1949, which, of course, if you know anything about dates at all, would be not long after the conclusion of World War II. When reading anything from that time period, from the late 30s to the late 40s and beyond, it's very hard to separate the writing from the war. And I think it would be foolish to separate this especially from the war, because it is very, very linked to it, especially in my interpretation, which will be coming up. He only lived to be 39 years old. He died in 1959. He was actually reasonably successful, which you don't hear a lot when it comes to like a lot of famous authors, artists. And so this poem would have been not one of the last that he wrote, but it's late enough in his life, late enough into his war poetry, of which he wrote quite a lot, that it's a very interesting reflection as a whole on the war and on himself. Interestingly, he managed to avoid conscription in World War II. He was in England at the time, and he managed to find a job where it was deemed too valuable, too important to send him away, and so he managed to get out of going. And that's very important when it comes to this poem. And then he is also known as one of the most popular Welsh poets ever. If you've read poetry before, if you're into poetry, it's very likely you've heard his name. My view on this is that Thomas's views on the war and the grieving that came after really, really come through in this work. I say that each bird is representative of a greater archetype, and they're all victims except for war itself, because it's more of just a concept than an actual figure. But they all get to their ends in very different ways. The figure, our narrator who observes the birds, stays out of most of the drama and is actually hardly in the poem at all. He simply sees it, remarks on it, and in the end records it. The hawk I would describe as the all-powerful force of war itself. He consumes everything. He kills every bird he comes in contact with, except for the heron, whom is the only bird to never come in very direct contact with the hawk. After everything is destroyed and all the birds of the hill and the valley are dead, the hawk is gone, out of the story, but everything becomes eerily silent, and so his impact is still felt. And if we apply this to war, the fact that all of these young people were sent there to die means that the silence, their missing presence at home, will of course have an impact even on those who never went to war. And that's what is important about the heron. The heron, I would say, is a person like Thomas himself, where he never went to war himself, but he is forced to grieve more so than anyone else, because he grieves every single loss, and he's the last voice on the hill and the valley by the conclusion of the poem, and so it's his duty to tell the story. He's the last voice. He has to speak for those who are voiceless. And even those who never see war are shaken by its impacts. We see that here, especially. The sparrows I described as being the conscripted. They're put up against a force they're unprepared for, and they quickly die. They go to the metaphorical gallows upon meeting war, or the hawk. That noose image keeps getting brought up. Clearly important. They're seemingly helpless. They don't get the chance to flee like the jackdaws, or the chance to make a choice of whether or not they go to meet the hawk like the chicks do. And the chicks themselves, I would say, are those who willingly enlist in the war. They send themselves to their doom. They chant, "Come, let us die," which mirrors what the hawk tried to tempt the heron into doing. And so they go without being asked or forced, and they needlessly die. They're young and inexperienced. They're the only infant animal in the poem, the only young animal in the poem, and many people who enlist, both now and then, are young, inexperienced, and not fully aware of what kind of situation they're putting themselves into. The jackdaws are bystanders, displaced victims of war. They come over the hillside, they're immediately attacked by the hawk, and so even when they're not involved in this, they still fall victim. Even with the chance to flee, they still fall victim. There is little they can do to get out. And of course we see that with refugees, with all groups of people who are trying to escape war. Oftentimes they're unable to. Their appearance is the least detailed. They're never actually specifically stated to have died, but with it being silent at the end, I think the assumption can be made that they do. Then there's the narrator, who, similarly to the heron, is removed enough from the events of the story to make him like a retrospective figure who grieves. His most important role is at the very, very end, in which he engraves the story told in the poem on a tablet, because the birds can no longer tell it themselves. And like all stories about war, Over Sir John's Hill reflects on what is lost and how something of it can still remain. Here, it's through the efforts of others like Thomas himself. In a final summary, Thomas's poem casts a light not only on the lives lost in the war, but on the effects of their absence at home. Without figures like the narrator and the heron, who I feel are both representative of Thomas, they could be easily reduced to nothing, a memory, or even less, nothing at all. Reflective of Thomas's own life, Over Sir John's Hill takes natural metaphors and applies them to the omnipresent, especially at the time, concept of war.